Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Flights of Fancy podcast, the podcast where we talk about combat and military aviation, past, present, and future. Unfortunately, this is going to be a redo episode, so Mr. X will not be with me today. I'm your host, Mr. O. We had some difficulties, or I had some difficulties after we recorded the entire session. The video portion kind of decided to clonk out. Anyways, we're redoing, or I'm redoing, anyways. So hopefully this will be a slightly more condensed episode. There was some insights provided by Mr. X. Hopefully, I'll try to point them out as they apply. So apologies if I'm missing anything from what we would have had in the first recording, and apologies to Mr. X for not getting that troubleshooted before we got to it. Without further ado, let's get into today's video, which is about the Curtiss Model 75, the Model 75, the P-36, the Hawk 75, however you want to address it. It is the topic for today. It is an aircraft that was developed and built by the Curtiss/Curtiss-Wright company. If you want to know more about the Curtiss-Wright company, please consider watching episode 3, the episode that we had on Curtiss's SB-2C Helldiver, for a little bit more info on the company and where it was manufacturing stuff and so on. Now, in comparison to that third episode, we didn't really get to talk too much about Mr. Donovan Berlin, the main designer for not only the Helldiver, but as well as today's topic. Now, Mr. Donovan doesn't have the same sort of history as a couple of the other designers that have been previously mentioned, specifically with the Ferry Fulmar episode. Now, Mr. Donovan was born in 1898. He would eventually graduate from Purdue University with the bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering in 1921. Subsequently, he works for the United States Army Air Corps, or the USAAC, conducting wind tunnel tests before eventually making his way to the Douglas Aircraft Company in 1926. A lot of the details or specific dates are missing, and sadly, I don't have a book. I don't know if there's any books dedicated specifically to Mr. Berlin himself. So anything I can find is mainly just crowdsourced on the internet. Regardless, after 1926, he changes employers in 1929 after working with the Douglas Company. He moves to Northrop, but eventually gets quote-unquote released. Now, I take it to mean that he was fired, and it seems to be over creative differences with Mr. Northrop himself. So this wasn't some sort of minor squabble or issues at a lower level, so to speak. Now, following this upset, he would eventually be hired by the Curtiss-Wright Company in 1934 and would stay there for about 7 years. This is how we end up getting the Helldiver, how we get the Hawk 75, and also kind of shows the change in how Curtiss, like several of Curtiss's models, and how they change effectively. Now, after those 7 years, it kind of becomes a rocky road of different companies that he ends up working for. He ends up working with GM. He finds himself working for the McDonnell Aircraft Company, Boeing, and eventually makes his way back to Curtiss-Wright. There's not much else I really know other than, or what might have happened to the man after his work in the aircraft or aeronautical industry. He sort of fades into obscurity in a sense. Also indicative of this being a redo, there's going to be already some drawings, so I'll try to point out the differences and why they're being pointed out. Now, as mentioned at the start, this particular story revolves around the Curtiss Hawk, which was otherwise internally known as the Model 75 within the company. Now, for brevity's sake, there's going to be several designations. I'm going to usually stick to the Hawk 75. It kind of covers most areas of not only Curtiss's internal designations, but also the export market. And for anything that is mentioned for as a P-36, that is generally only going to be applicable to United States-based aircraft. So with the Model 75, it started in around 1934, 1935. What would eventually be the genesis of the design would be a competition that was announced by the United States Army Air Corps. And this contest being announced for 1935 to take place at the end of May. Now, with that sort of deadline in place, the Curtiss-Wright company decided that they would want to be a part of this competition for a single-seat fighter, and started work in October of 1934. Their design would be using an all-metal construction, which was kind of a new thing at the time. Aircraft within the 1930s still used a mix of wood, fabric, and metal construction in various degrees. You can kind of see this in biplane aircraft from various nations, such as like the CR-32, CR-42. You also see it in the Hawker Hurricane, where it also mixes features of wood, fabric, and metal. But all metal construction would eventually be the next step in aeronautic design. The design itself used initially a Wright XR-1670-5 14-cylinder 2-row radial engine that was rated at about 900 horsepower. The design was also meant to be carrying a 50 cal machine gun and a 30 cal machine gun. Now, one of the things that Mr. X pointed out as well was one of the more interesting parts of the design by Curtiss was implementing a rotating landing gear. So under normal circumstances in the mid-1930s, there's still quite a few designs out there that rely on fixed landing gear. And fixed landing gear is obviously problematic for a design that wants to go fast, because you have to include the drag of the wheels and their struts into basically the aircraft's profile. Now, with a retractable landing gear, you can eliminate that sort of stop that kills, that takes up a significant amount of speed as you're moving through the air. So the way to that Curtiss had designed their structure would be that while there is a small lump that we can see, the big circle in red here, that's basically where the landing gear was stored, the main strut, and it would retract the wheel into this dark patch where the second red circle is, which is basically where the wheel rotates 90 degrees to be flush with the wing itself. Now, this was seen as an advanced design, again, because it's not the standard, as well as being all metal. It's looking like a promising design, a very forward-thinking design in 1934/35. Now, unfortunately, it gets rather tough to try and distinguish certain engines just because there's not much documentation as to what each engine may look like from a particular angle or at any particular time. Typically, a photo here we can see in these two photos, they're actually the same plane. If we look at the rear designation, the civil designation, anyways, which is X17Y, that's the number for the prototype of the Model 75. And so, because of that, you kind of have to try and figure out via comparison to other planes. Now, the problem with that is that certain engines didn't really last all that long. They had a couple models produced, certainly no large production, and then they kind of just fall off because there's a better engine around the corner and they'll just substitute for that. So the only way I can assume that the upper photo is a R1670 is by the air scoop at the top of the engine. And the only way I can manage this is by comparing to photos of a different aircraft used by the U.S. at the time, that also had scoops at the same locations and was reported to have the same engine. The different engine, which I'm not 100% sure on, so I can't really. It's even harder to take a guess for the Model 75B. While there is data that says what it's supposed to have, I don't know if this photo is indicative of that. Um, Regardless, in the end, the R1670 is just not powerful enough. There's teething issues, and Curtiss, as a company, decides that they'll go with something else. And what they end up landing on is the Pratt and Whitney R1535 Twin Wasp Junior, which only was rated for 700 horsepower. As you can imagine, that's a significant decrease on what they were hoping to get. And unfortunately for them, the Twin Wasp Junior also develops problems. Um, this eventually is succeeded by the XR1820 39, which itself was rated for 940 horsepower. And it's claimed that that pairing is what would be known as the Model 75B. Now, again, I would like to preface that in the previous slide, the bottom aircraft that could be the Model 75 with the 1820 engine, but it could be a Twin Wasp Junior. I'm not entirely sure. I may not have looked at enough photos of both engines in cowlings and such, but regardless, here is where we are at. Um, Now, the Curtiss Model 75, specifically the B, would end up seeing, the model in and of itself would first take flight on the 15th of May 1935, and would eventually see competition against Seversky's SEV-1XP model. Now, unfortunately for Seversky, when the competition was initially taking place in late May of 1935, their aircraft crashed en route, which caused a delay in the competition itself. Um, they obviously, if the United States is trying to get the best, and they don't want to necessarily spend a whole lot of money on a bunch of different designs, then they'll just wait until the aircraft is fixed and it can come back for proper trials. Um, After it was delayed the first time, the trials that is, there seems to have been some protest or issue between the United States Army Air Corps and Curtiss itself. Um, the Curtiss book I read cites that there's some sort of informal fly off in between the initial date and when the competition should have actually taken place. And because of this, they end up pushing the entire trial yet again. As far as I can tell, this claim was based around Seversky having just flown their aircraft for some United States government officials at some point. Although I can't seem to find anything concrete at the moment about it. Now, despite all this, the competition ends up taking place in 1936 in April, and to Curtiss's dismay, it's the Seversky design that ends up taking first place. So the Army Air Corps gets a contract out, puts it for the Seversky. It's labeled the P-35, and they order, I forget how many, but they order a bunch of them. And in the competing data here, the only real notable thing, at least to my mind, is that while both aircraft are very similar, Seversky's design manages to more than double the range of Curtiss's model. I'm not entirely sure how they manage that. And it also, the Swirsky's design also has a very distinctive look. It's much stubbier, shorter, and higher than Curtis's version. Now, in all of this, Curtiss still found itself to be lucky in a sense. The Army Air Corps, after seeing the trials, after having decided on the Seversky model, still gave Curtiss a bit of a handshake and saying, it's fine, we think that your designs could still be of use and be good, may just need a little bit more work or maybe different engines and so on. So what they end up doing is they go to Curtiss and they give them a contract for 3 evaluation planes. The only stipulation appears to have been that they had to use Pratt and Whitney R1830-13 twin Wasp engines, themselves being rated for 900 horsepower. Now, the Army eventually designates these the Y1 P-36, which eventually becomes the P-36. After some successful trials, it appears that there's another set of trials for a new design that takes place in about 1937. Curtiss, with their P-36 aircraft, managed to successfully place top position. Um, after getting after passing the trials, they keep the same armament, so they still have the 50 cal, the 30 cal. They change to a different engine, and the contract that's awarded to them is for 210 aircraft, which, if the Curtiss book I have is correct, states that it's at the time it was the United States' largest purchase of aircraft since the First World War, or largest singular purchase of aircraft since then. Um, while the 210 aircraft run is being built, a couple of changes end up being affected to various different airframes. From what I've been able to gather, there's changes that are made to the 20th aircraft, the 4th and 10th airframes, the 85th aircraft, the 147th, and the 172nd seem to be the major ones that have undergone any sort of changes. Now, most of these changes are rather small. They're nothing too huge, but they're still changes nonetheless. From the 20th aircraft, they receive a new engine, basically just a higher horsepower, and it eventually receives the designation P-36B. The next change would be the addition of 30 cal machine guns in the wings. Now, initially, the U.S. fighters only ever carried 2 machine guns. It seemed to just be the style at the time. And as I was speaking with Mr. X about it, he was pointing out rather thoughtfully that the thing to keep in mind is that the 30 cal machine gun was used more as a ranging machine gun, very much more for aiding the pilot in finding out where his shots would land, and having the 50 cal be the one that you hopefully land your shots on and deal a lot more damage with. The prevailing thought being that putting ammunition on a plane is, I don't want to say necessarily tough, but it adds weight. And so to manage to conserve your ammo in that sort of sense just ends up being the way that the U.S. wants to work with. Now, eventually, that sort of doctrine changes. They start going the way of many different machine guns, mostly because they never really had a good autocannon to place on their aircraft. Mr. X also pointed out that there was despite the purchase of a functioning aircraft autocannon by in regards to the Hispano Suiza, which is a 20 millimeter autocannon, which was developed or at least produced by the British in World War II. And even though they got those designs, it never seemed to work out in the same way. American manufacturers seem to have difficulties producing the weapon, and apart from the P-38, which would have that cannon, or at least a 20 millimeter cannon initially, and throughout its run, it's very rare to see American aircraft with 20 millimeter cannons. It'd only be near the end, if you discount one of the earlier Mustang variants, you only really see it on later naval aircraft. And even then, the prevailing weapon or armament on U.S. fighters at the time still remains the 50 cal machine gun. Another thing to keep in mind is that a 30 cal machine gun is not necessarily a very large bullet. You're looking at somewhere around 7.56, I think it was, in terms of millimeter, so in terms of size. And so at a certain point, not only do fighter aircraft become faster, they can carry more, but they also become better armored. And it kind of signifies the end of what would be rifle caliber armament on aircraft. There's only so much that a 7-point anything bullet can do in terms of damage against an airplane. And it's typically why you see aircraft that have that sort of armament having many, many guns on them, such as the 12 machine gun Hurricane. That it's more so that you can pepper your target with a lot of hits, hoping that you hit something important, rather than if you had even a 50 cal machine gun does hits a lot more powerfully. But with autocannons, it's multiplied more so, where a good hit, even if it doesn't seem all that important, could theoretically knock out a plane, rather than having to rely on luck with rifle calibers. So all to say that we can see one of the modifications here, one of the weird changes in my mind to the P-36, which is when they included the machine guns, they also included two boxes. So the wings both had boxes, and this was meant to catch brass. I'm not entirely sure why it was necessary to capture brass or capture brass in that specific way. There is the fact that the brass has to fall somewhere, and that may have just been the most convenient way. They're not large boxes, so it doesn't impact flight performance all that much, but it at least serves as a visual indicator to what the boxes look like. There are also some other designs that used the cannons, and they have a less box-like structure than just the wing guns as seen. Now, when it comes to the other various experimental P-36s, the only major changes after the C were just to some armament. Now, they initially brought the machine guns in the wings up to 4 machine guns. Then they decided that they would experiment with 6. This includes the 2 in the nose as well. before eventually also trying out 23mm Madsen cannons in the wings, which are again representative of the Hawk 75O up here. The last experimental types that we will look at are the XP-37, P-37, the XP-42, and the XP-40. Now, when it comes to these experimental versions, these were mainly engine reworks or engine changes. So, for the XP-37/P-37, they basically tried to include an Allison inline engine, but with a massive supercharger. We can see that the cockpit is much further back, and as Mr. X pointed out, this space is given mostly to the supercharger, and why the cockpit had to be further back. The YP-37s, despite having the longer fuselage, the new engines, the superchargers were still in their infancy at the time. And so they were never truly able to overcome problems that they had with them. Similarly, we have the XP-42 on the right, which was more of a test to determine if they could eliminate the amount of drag that was produced by a radial engine. Now, if we look at say this image of a radial engine aircraft, we can see that there's a large portion. Basically, it's as large as the fuselage, if not larger. If we're looking at the cross section up top, you can see just how much the nose, how large it is, and how it shrinks down in comparison to the rest of the airframe. And so you can imagine how much of a drag that is to have that huge blunt object just at the front of the aircraft. And so for the XP-42, if they can manage to give it a very tight cowling, give it a large propeller, and compensate by giving it a large chin to act as an air scoop for all the air that the engine needs to actually work, they can hopefully get something that eliminates as much drag as possible while keeping the same sort of speed that you would expect from a radial engine. The tests were unsuccessful as far as I can tell. The one major problem that you typically see with this sort of design is that it's high tolerances. And so if anything goes wrong, you lose a lot of the effect of the design. So they never really stuck with it, as far as I can tell. Now, lastly, we also have the XP-40, which was another aircraft that used an Allison inline engine. And I'd love to go further into it, but we're going to get that into it in a later episode. The only reason for this is honestly because the XP-40 is the predecessor of the very successful P-40 Warhawk, an aircraft that was used by many nations across the globe and was more successful than the P-36 at the very least. Lastly, the one other offshoot that I should mention is the Hawk 75-R. Essentially, it's the same as a P-36, except it's fitted with a turbo supercharger under the nose, and while it was extensively tested by the USAC, it was eventually returned to Curtiss after the system proved itself to be unreliable. One of the issues with superchargers is that to get the full effect out of the supercharger itself, you have to monitor the engine a lot while flying. And the USAC basically determined that it was too much of a demand that made it impractical for use during in a combat situation. So rather than try to finagle the system or do anything with it, the US just decided to reject it and say, you know what, come back to us when the design has more of a leg to stand on. Sorry, parched here. Now, here we also have the Model 75H, which also would eventually turn into Model 75M. Now, I have to also give a short disclaimer in that when talking about the Model 75 or the Hawk 75 or the P-36, this was a very tumultuous time for a lot of nations. Um, the flames of war were kindling in a lot of different nations and a lot of different states. And so um, countries decided that they needed to supplement their air forces, and air forces were in a lot of respects still primitive at the time, either in tactics and doctrine, or in manpower, or available airframes, or the quality of those designs. And so, um, if there's some back and forth in the timeline, I apologize if it gets a little confusing, but there's no real good way to talk about the Model 75. So, when it comes to the 75H, the creation of it happened at the same time as when Curtiss received the contract for the 3 evaluation planes that would eventually turn into the P-36. The 75H was an attempt by Curtiss to sell an export design to nations that had already purchased the Hawk 3, which was a biplane fighter by Curtiss. Now, there's not much that is really stated about what needed to be changed for the aircraft to be an export model. Typically, when you see export models or licensed versions and etc., the aircraft has technology that is removed from it if it is deemed too sensitive or too valuable in nature to be sold outside of that country. And so I don't know if this is a specific request by the United States Army Air Corps. I suspect that it is not, and it's more a Curtiss design. But they changed the undercarriage so that it was a fixed design instead of the retracting version. Now, the one reason why I believe this had to be a Curtiss and only a Curtiss decision was that they stated that they wanted to replace their Hawk 3 biplane fighter, and the biplane fighter had fixed undercarriage. And so, to keep that sort of familiarity with pilots, they would offer a version that had fixed landing gear. It seems silly, I guess, nowadays, but in the 1930s, when retractable landing gear was becoming an actual common thing, it was very difficult to train pilots to have to understand that difference, especially if they'd had years and years and years of flight time with fixed undercarriage only aircraft. Planes would land with their landing gear up, damage the aircraft, and in some cases led to larger accidents and even mortalities. Now, the aircraft that they would eventually sell both end up having the original armament of a 50 cal and a 30 cal in the nose, while a second aircraft had the additional 30 cal guns in the wings. So I'm not sure if this is just a reflection of light here or some funky shadows or whatnot, but I believe the top photo is the 4-gun version, whereas the bottom one may not. It's also a little hard because, I mean, this line is pretty straight. It could be a machine gun, but it seems to poke out maybe a little bit too far. In any case, the both of these aircraft would end up being sold. One goes to China, one goes to Argentina. It appears that the 2-gun plane is the one that gets lost. I'm not really sure how. There's no definitive source that states what exactly happened to it. Um, and this would only be one book, whereas everybody else says that the two gun version is the one that was sold to Argentina. Um, I'll get back to it in a little bit, but just keep that in mind. So these versions they end up being known as the Hawk 75H. They're just export planes, and they're essentially one-offs for that purpose. After the two countries receive their examples, China becomes the first to make a large purchase outside of the U.S. So they end up having an order for 30 aircraft, and these all end up finding their way into China between May and August of 1938. Now, there's some sources that state that this entire number is 112, and that it's the 75s are all Model 75Ms. But it's hard to get exact data on this sort of thing. Um, the other 82 of this 30 aircraft contract eventually these get canceled. So again, not really sure if the 112 of the 75Ms is true or not, but the 82 other ones, they allegedly they get canceled, and this is because China says, you know what, we like the aircraft that you're giving us, but we're hearing things about this Hawk 75A5, which we'll get to. And you know what? We actually prefer the idea of the A5, so we're gonna, you know what, cancel our order and give us A5s once you get to those. Now another order comes in, but this time from Argentina, and the order is for 29 aircraft, and they receive the design that has four 30 cal machine guns instead of any 50 cals, as far as I can tell. Now, of these 29, this is sort of why I don't believe that one was lost just mysteriously, and that it had to be the one that was sold to Argentina, because why buy 29 when you can have an even 30? Eventually, this also leads into an extra 20 being purchased, although these would end up being assembled by Argentina itself rather than Curtiss. 12 other airframes are eventually delivered to Thailand as well, although instead they choose to retain twin 30 cal machine guns in the nose, as well as 23mm cannons in the wings. Now, it's a little strange, to me anyways, because there's a contention that the aircraft sent to Thailand never used the 23mm cannons. However, as we can see down here, this is a photo. This is a current aircraft on display. It is the only Hawk 75N on display, or in existence, and it is currently, I believe, located in the Thailandese Air Force Museum. So we can see it has this is not a this would not be a machine gun as far as I can tell. We can also see it's outfitted with bombs. So I mean, you can make up your own minds as to what you believe is true in the reporting, but it seems to me that all 12 aircraft that were delivered to Thailand would likely have been the 23mm cannon version. Now, the US and Chinese purchases were not the only major orders for Curtiss. In 1938, in February, the French government contacts Curtiss and begins acquisition and negotiations to acquire 100 fighters from the company. These were basically based off of the P-36. However, they would eventually get their own designation. Curtiss was very adamant in creating new designations for all their subsequent designs. as mentioned previously, the company gave it the designation Model 75. And this is mostly just because in 1934/1935, the company decided that it wanted to give a model designation to all its planes. The P-36 slash Hawk 75 just ended up being the first aircraft that they did it with. So a lot of previous models were all given a designation after the fact. And future aircraft would all get it supposedly when they were designed. And so with them wanting to rename a bunch of stuff, with them giving new designations to all their different variations and so on, what ends up happening is Curtiss says, we're going to give a new designation. This time, we're just going to call it the Hawk 75. And we're going to give it a letter prefix, in this case A, and a number suffix. So how it works is that the A is supposed to signify that it is an export contract, and the number is supposed to signify which contract that aircraft belongs to. The problem with this is that it doesn't exactly it proves origin from time to time, but not 100%. And what I mean by this is that we're going to see a bunch of different variants, and some of them will eventually have their designations changed to a prior designation, which just muddies the water in trying to figure out what the exact source of an aircraft is. Now, designations aside, the original French contract, the 75A1, these would all have Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin Wasp engines. They're rated for 950 horsepower, and these engines are specifically export type engines. That was one of the other things that you typically see with export aircraft in the United States. They're lacking things like they may lack a supercharger that might be normally found on the engine, and so on. So their performance doesn't exactly match what would typically be quote unquote original Hawk 75 that you might find in the United States' arsenal. The notable changes that you would find on a Hawk 75 is the ones you would expect. French instrumentation, so your speedometer, your altimeter, etc. Those are all in whatever the French measurements are. I'm pretty sure they use metric, but just in case. They also use what's called a reverse throttle. The French have a goofy way of doing things in that, whereas under normal conditions, when you move your throttle forward, you're applying power. For the French, if you moved it forward, you were reducing power, which kind of messes with people. I don't know if that's still the method that they use in current day aircraft. I suspect it's not, but I don't have any manuals to look into for some of the current aircraft at the moment. One of the other major changes too is that they use French MGs instead. So rather than using 30 cal machine guns, they're all standardized on 7.5 millimeter guns. We can see here, this is what they would normally be carrying. So two in the wings, one on each side, and two in the nose. The other thing I would like to point out is that I don't know why they did this specifically, but the French called this the H-75-C1, C being chasseur, which is pursuit or chasing. So this would be a one-seat fighter aircraft, but I don't know why they went with that. Seems strange not to just call it a variant or whatnot, but maybe they were just hoping that if there was a big enough variation, they just call it a Hawk 76 or something. Regardless, we then go to the Hawk 75 A2 and A3. Now, the A2 is a kind of middleman in that on the second contract, called the A2s, This would be for the another 100 aircraft, so bringing up the total produced or paid for to 200. And the problem is that by the 41st aircraft in that 100 aircraft contract, they changed to having 6 guns instead of 4, and also going with a more powerful engine. So you can kind of see the outline of 2 machine guns here on the wings. It's less obvious in this photo. But that's the basic gist of it, is that midway through the A2 contract, they changed it a bit, and so placing an A2 is mostly comes down to what armament and what engine it has. Um, Next up is the Hawk 75A3. This is as can be expected, the third contract from France, and it now has an even more powerful engine. Um, I'm it for the astute viewer, you'll notice that the BF 109 E3 here is a captured British example, whereas the Hawk 75A3 is actually a model that was captured by the Germans and sold to Finland. So the Hawk 75 with its 6 machine guns, the BF 109 typically has 2 7.92 millimeter machine guns and one 20 millimeter cannon. The E3 can vary sometimes. Sometimes you'll see it with two cannons in the wings, or 2 cannons in the wings and one in the nose, plus the machine guns. But the base structure of the variant of the type was having 2 machine guns and 1 cannon. The one thing to point out really is just that the 109 is a lot faster than the 75, whereas the 75 has a lot more range than the 109. And it's kind of indicative of the problems that, well, both aircraft have. This isn't to say that the Hawk 75 is a bad aircraft. We'll get to it later in the presentation, but um, each of these aircraft definitely have their limitations on them. Now, further into the contracts, France is desperate for more aircraft, even though they've already gotten something like 300 aircraft. They need more, and so they draw up a fourth contract. I think in total they're supposed to have something like 765 or so aircraft, and shortly after that they signed the contract and Curtiss started delivering examples to France. France capitulates due to the Blitzkrieg, and so the rest of the order is basically cut short. Now, not to leave Curtiss in a bit of a bind, but the British Air Forces or the British government says, well, the French have already paid for the contract, and we still need aircraft of our own, and they're already on the way. So we'll take over all the excess production, and we'll put it into our own Air Force. Subsequently, every aircraft, every Hawk 75A designation switches over to a Mohawk name. So the way it works is that you'll have if you have an A1, it's called a Mohawk 1. If you have an A2, it's a Mohawk 2, and so on and so forth. So for these aircraft, for the A4, it gets renamed to a Mohawk 4. And then we get into a bit of a problem with the naming schemes. So, with regards to these Mohawks, first and foremost, of the ones that end up being used by the British, 72 get transferred to South Africa, and 12 get transferred to Portugal, just to outfit their units. The A5, what is likely an A5 anyways, that we can see at the bottom left, that was a pattern aircraft, or that was an aircraft that was supposed to be used by China. If you remember, I mentioned that instead of 75Ms, they wanted to have A5s. And the A5s would have been retracting air gear or landing gear, larger firepower, etc., different engine, and so on. But what ended up happening is that allegedly China gets one pattern aircraft and they build it at Camco. And if memory serves me correctly, Camco is the Chinese American um, aircraft manufacturing company. And it's a joint venture by Americans and Chinese to work together so that they can promote friendship and so on by some independently wealthy um, uh, man in the United States. Now, because of Japanese aggression and the fact that they were capturing more and more territory in China, the Camco company had to basically shutter its operations. And so the aircraft that were being sent to China eventually would be diverted to India, and they were assembled there by HAL, which I forget the name for at the moment, but a company within India that's aircraft manufacturing. Now, these A5s, what ended up happening to them is, well, India is still basically a part of the British Empire, and so the British get hold of the A5s and rename them Mohawk 4s. I don't really know why they didn't keep going with the naming convention. Um, there's not much that really differentiates a A5 from an A4 as far as I can tell. So I don't know. They just went with it. Other variants that we eventually see are the Hawk 75A6. This would be a contract for Norway, which was very similar to the Hawk A2. The only difference, or only major difference, is that instead of having 7.5 millimeter machine guns, it uses 7.9 millimeter machine guns. I don't know if this is specifically a unique cartridge or if this was more representative of 7.92 Mauser. I don't believe it's the case because it seems weird to omit that one number if they meant to reference that. Now, 24 of these A6s are ordered by Norway. They only receive 12 before they as well capitulate, and the other 12 end up being taken over by Britain, and Britain decides to call them Mohawk 2s, which again just adds more to the confusion. The A7 ends up being a contract purchased by the Royal Netherlands Indies Army. They ordered 20 of these aircraft, and as far as I can tell, they receive all 20 of them, and they're used in actions against the Japanese Air Force. The A8 is a secondary contract by Norway. Much like the first contract, they were all canceled just because the country capitulated before anything could really happen. What ends up happening with the A8s is that they're still built. They weren't canceled in time, I guess we'll say. And they were taken up by the United States Air Force. And they renamed them P-36Gs and would eventually transfer, of the 36 that were eventually built, the 30 of them, or sorry, 6 of them were given to the Free Norwegian Forces in Canada so that they could fly with them, and they retained the 30 remaining ones. These aircraft, the P-36Gs, would eventually be given away or sold to Peru under a Lend-Lease agreement in 1943. And the only reason to really be able to differentiate between the two, if you see photos, or at least the easiest way I can tell, is this additional bit and bob on the top of the airframe, which is a navigational piece of equipment that would have been used in Canada. Not specifically in Canada, just that's what they were using at the time in Canada. Now, lastly, there was also a contract called the 75A-9, which was for a batch of 10 aircraft, and this was for the Kingdom of Persia. However, Persia would eventually capitulate due to the British and Soviet forces, and the 10 aircraft were taken over by the RAF, and these would also be renamed Mohawk 4s to further add to confusion. Now, from sources that I can find, of the total 795 aircraft that were ordered by France, there was the initial 200 aircraft in both contracts 1 and 2 together. Um, there was a third contract which I believe was for another 100, and the fourth contract they had would be for another that remaining 500 plus aircraft. But because of France's capitulation, they only ever received 6 of the A4s that were supposed to reach them. There's some differences in numbers. I know at least one book states that of that the fourth order was 795 aircraft, and then they received 284. But I don't believe that one is correct. Um, Other thing to note is that, as previously stated, with the photos for the comparison with the Hawk 75 A3 and the 109 E3, a lot of the Hawks were captured still in their shipping crates, which gives you an idea as to how quickly a lot of these nations capitulated, and why the pace of conflict was so great. A lot of these aircraft that were captured by Germany would eventually find their way into Finnish hands as they were fighting their own conflict against the Russians at the time. And Finland, devoid of any major manufacturing capability in terms of aircraft, needed to find sources of material elsewhere. The combat record of the Hawk 75 is actually rather remarkable in outside of American hands. Many more aircraft were in conflict above foreign skies, and there's only one instance of P-36s in conflict with American pilots that I can tell. When it comes to Finland and France, they reported that their P-36s slash Hawk 75s did rather well. Um, Having that amount of firepower is obviously a benefit to them rather than the initial anemic 50 cal and 30 cal only. Additionally, the Royal Netherlands Indies Army and the Thailand Air Force did rather well. They both appreciated their Hawk 75s as far as as I've seen from mentions, and yeah, comparatively, the United States only ever used the P-36 once, and that was at the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th in 1941. After that, there seems to be no recorded use in combat for them. Additionally, a couple of extra notes here. 10 of the U.S. Army's P-36As were given to Brazil in March of 1942. And aside from a couple of extra bits in the photos here, that's mostly, yeah, I think that's mostly it. So a few quick things I wanted to note. It is stated that the P-36 had an ammo counter, and this is true. I don't really have any better photos, sadly. I could use a video game to represent it, but it doesn't exactly show the rest of the cockpit as being correct. And, well, I figure some people might give me guff if I tried to show that. So in this photo on the left, we can see that there's two square dials on the dash, on the left, on the right. Both of these are ammo counters, and as far as I can tell, these would only work for the nose guns, so the wing guns do not apply, and they're both marked 500, so they basically tick down as ammunition is expended. Additionally, while it it wasn't stated, kind of glossed over with the Hawk 75N, but the Hawk 75 was capable of carrying bombs as well. Not only the small, like 25, 50-pound bombs that we saw earlier, but they could carry up to two 100-pound bombs under each wing. And they could also carry a 500-pound bomb under the fuselage with the proper rack. This is from an official pamphlet by Curtiss, and uh, quizzically, they added the fact that if so desired, a purchaser could ask for an Edo twin float installation to turn the P-36 slash Hawk 75 into a seaplane. Sadly, this seems to be a completely missed opportunity from every export or purchaser out there. Can't really blame them. Seaplanes gets to be fickle territory if you don't have the proper facilities for them. But I'm very curious what if had this ever been truly the case. I don't know of any photos, either abroad or from Curtiss itself, that has ever tried to show a P-36 with a seaplane arrangement. So sadly, this one document is the only thing I can provide. In terms of showing stuff, the other thing I wanted to point out, just as an interesting fact, is initially the way that the Americans had their camouflage. I came across these three images individually and just thought it'd be a nice representation of another what if that we missed out on. Namely, the fact that in pre-war years, they typically had aircraft in more bright and colorful markings and designations. So we can see the color markings for the nation in the back. You have U.S. Army or U.S. Navy underneath the wing with a nice little star blue circle in red meatball, as well as a yellow nose. This is typical of a Army setup. In terms of Navy, they would typically go with yellow wings and a blue frame. For the trials or the war games that they held, pre-war anyways, they had these wonderfully colorful designs with orange and dark green slash jade and white. But sadly, they would move away from this and go to a very standard olive drab over light gray. Another little interesting tidbit is that while this was the initial marking to designate U.S. aircraft, this symbol would go through a number of changes, and one of the major ones was the elimination of the red dot, as it apparently confused certain people into thinking that it may be a Japanese aircraft. Japanese aircraft at the time sporting a giant red circle. Now, this is just the timeline of various variants of the Hawk 75. This is as best as I can figure it out. Sadly, for a lot of the experimental versions, they don't come with exact dates as to when a particular engine was applied to a particular frame. And so everything here is basically my best guess on the left. As to when these aircraft were either purchased or designed. Similarly, on the right, the only thing I really wanted to really talk about is in terms of different models for the upper portion up here. We have the Model 75A, which was the one of the original aircraft frames. The A having the original engine. This was changed, this was modified into the 75J, the J having an external supercharger, which would eventually be changed to the Model 75R, the R being an internal supercharger, which would then go to the Model 75I slash XP37, which was the inline engine that we saw, and the YP37 being the actual test bit version for U.S. trials. So technically, they're all like the same airframe. They're just different engines and eventually different modifications as the fuselage needed to be elongated and so on. The other thing, too, is at the bottom here. I forgot to add a note for the A6 that it was redesignated a Mohawk 2. Um, but yeah, it just goes to show how confusing the designations could be at the this sort of chaotic period in Curtiss's company time. And lastly, as always, this page is intentionally left blank. Sources, as always, there's I can guarantee you that the above link for Soyuyo will be used for the P-40. It's a lovely website that has a lot of drawings of just very minute differences between the P-40's actual design drawings and some models. So definitely go give them a look if you're interested in the P-40 or even modeling. It just kind of gives you a really good idea as to how accurate or inaccurate designs can sometimes be when transferred from paper to print. And as always, the list of books that I have, one of them being Not So Great, recently got the Allied Aircraft Piston Engines, and it's a really good book if you're interested on the various US or British engines. Sadly, it doesn't cover a lot of, or any of the French or other foreign designs. And lastly, as always, you can find us on Twitter at twitter.com/fancypodcast and on Patreon. Please, if you're so inclined, send me a message, shout me out, and if there's any questions or whatnot, I'll see what I can do to answer them. Or at the very least, give you guys information on when the next episode might drop. Apologies again to Mr. X. I really wanted to get this episode out after the previous, after the screw up I had. So that's the only reason why there's not a second person chatting today. Additionally, in the original recording, we didn't know what specifically we were going to go with for the next episode, and I believe we have solved that conundrum, and we're going to go with the Bristol Blenheim, or Blenheim, or Blenheim, however they say it. But that'll be our next episode. So thanks for tuning in, and stay in touch, and we'll see you next time.